When the U.S. entered World War II, Franklin D. Roosevelt made it clear that he thought Major League Baseball should continue. But as thousands of minor league players and more than 500 major league players left their teams to serve in the military, the owner of the Chicago Cubs, Philip K. Wrigley, became concerned about the game's future. Wrigley went on to become founder of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball Team in 1943. Just as women working in factories was supposed to be temporary, Wrigley thought of the Women's League as another temporary wartime measure. Rather than fading out, the league's audience grew after the war, peaking in 1948 when over 900,000 fans attended that season's games. The All-American League changed how women were perceived, but most standards remained the same. All-American players were supposed to look feminine on and off the field. They couldn't be seen with their hair too short, wear pants in public, or go to bars while on the road. And all teams had a female chaperone who traveled with them and was supposed to accompany players on any dates. Wrigley's wife, Helen Blanchett Atwater Wrigley, played a large role in shaping the women's images. Helen sent the ladies to charm school and came up with the idea of above-the-knee dresses that were worn as uniforms. Without pants to protect their legs, the women constantly developed strawberries, or welts and bruises, from sliding into base. Lois Youngin, who played for the Kenshaw Comets between 1951 and 1954, said, "Every time you raise your arms, your whole uniform came up in the air." But by this time, Philip Wrigley was no longer worried about the future of men's baseball and was losing interest in women's league. At the end of that year's season, he sold it to Arthur Mainhoff. This doesn't mean it disappeared, though. One way in which the league did not evolve was racial integration. When Wrigley started the league in 1943, it followed the MLB's policy of not hiring black players. Yet after Jackie Robinson became the first black player to join the MLB in 1947, the Women's League continued to exclude black women. A common theme for women during World War II seems to be women's positions, thought only to be temporary, but actually leading to a long fight for equality.
During World War II, many countries developed codes as a way of sending secret messages about things such as upcoming battles or troop movements. Deciphering or breaking these codes was a way for the Allies to listen in on their enemies' plans and learn about battles before they even happened. And the sudden need for codebreakers offered a new opportunity to college-educated women. The women codebreakers served many roles. They listened for coded radio messages from other countries. They collected things like the names of enemy ships and commanders that could be in a coded message, and therefore could help break it. They looked for patterns, for instance, where and when messages were sent could be clues about troop movements. They even tested American codes to make sure enemies couldn't break them. And one of the most well-known women codebreakers was Elizabeth Smith Friedman. It was not until 2008 that records detailing her involvement in World War II were declassified. Up until then, most Americans had never even heard of her. Over her career, Friedman cracked hundreds of ciphers, and she was America's first female cryptanalyst. She successfully busted smugglers during the Prohibition and most notably broke up a Nazi spy ring across South America in the 1940s. Working for the Coast Guard, she led a team that eavesdropped on German spies as they discussed the movements of Allied ships in South America. In 1942, Friedman's worst fear had come true. Cover transmissions from the Nazis abruptly stopped. This was a sign that her targets had discovered they were being spied on. Now Friedman was left to pick up the mess of their somewhat failed mission. Eventually, she and her team used analog methods to break 3 separate Enigma machine codes. By December 1942, her team had cracked every one of the Nazis' new codes. The saddest part is that one of the most influential women of World War II was written out of history textbooks. And yet another influential woman in codebreaking named Agnes Meyer Driscoll was a Navy female codebreaker and one of the greatest cryptanalysts of all time who broke Japan's secret code. She joined the Navy's new cryptographic research desk, serving as a cryptanalyst. The group's goal was to exploit Japan's main operational codebook nicknamed the Red Book, a copy of which had been stolen by the U.S. Navy. She was also tasked with the new Japanese General Purpose Fleet Code, more commonly known as JN-25. That complicated code was used by the Japanese for the most secret and high-level naval communications. Driscoll was able to successfully solve the cipher component of this code.
D-Day, the 6th of June 1944. Over 150,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy.
They're on the beach, plunging waist deep into the sea.
The Mammoth operation marked the beginning of the end of the Second World War. But this attack to liberate Europe from German occupation would never have been as successful without the code-breaking computer Colossus. The computer was Colossus by name, but the task it was undertaking was colossal by nature. Between 1944 and 1945, the computer decoded over 13,500 messages between Hitler and his army commanders. And these are some of the women behind it, who helped build and operate Colossus. Margaret Bullen helped wire the computer.
I'd never used a soldering iron in my life. I didn't know what you did with it. It was quite extraordinary how quickly I learned about it.
At 17, she had no idea of the magnitude of the job she'd taken on.
First thing we did was to sign the Official Secrets Act, because we mustn't, and I mean that to me was, well, you didn't say anything. I don't think my parents knew what I did.
Living a double life.
Exactly. But I mean, they knew I was here doing war work. I mean, I could have been making bombs for all they knew.
Lorna Cockayne, who operated Colossus, is also glad she can now talk about her time at Bletchley.
I was pleased I did it. I'm more than pleased that people know about it, because we couldn't talk about it. My eldest brother was in the army, so I didn't see him. My other brother was in the Air Force and was flying Lancasters. I was virtually on my own, so it was nice to have the company of friends.
With next week marking the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings, a new exhibit at the National Museum of Computing is celebrating the contribution these women made to the Second World War.
I can remember the chap in the office where we worked coming in one day and saying, "You can go home now, the war's over." Just like that, the war's over, you can go home.
It's their stories that will keep the legacy of Bletchley Park's Wrens alive. Helen Mulroy, BBC Look East.
Members of the United States Army Nurse Corps were also members of the Angels of Bataan. These nurses were stationed in the Philippines in the outset of the Pacific War, where they served in the Battle of the Philippines. This group also included U.S. Army and U.S. Navy nurses who were stationed at the Steinberg Hospital, General Hospital in Manila, and other military hospitals around Manila. These Angels of Bataan included 77 American military nurses taken prisoner in the Philippines. They provided life-saving care to civilians in POWs in the Santos Tomos and Los Banos internment camps, where they were held from 1942 to 1945. Nurses became separated from their male counterparts who were in the service and held with civilian POWs in these internment camps. These camps were extremely undersupplied but provided vital professional care to all of those Allied POWs helped there. Many nurses survived the long imprisonment from May 1942 to February 1945 after liberation. They received little recognition as military prisoners of war. A large number of these nurses were quoted on saying they didn't do anything extraordinary, they were just doing their job. I don't consider myself a hero, none of us do. From Lieutenant Colonel Madeline Ulam. At the beginning of the war, the Philippines was a choice assignment for nurses who were just looking for a little adventure for a 2-year tour on duty. These nurses adapted their schedule by pivoting from their regular duty shifts to trauma nursing and tending to the casualties in the bombing of Clarkfield. Many of these nurses were able to escape Manila, where most of them were based. 11 nurses soon surrendered prior to the Japanese capture of the capital city of Manila in January. These nurses worked around the clock in both hospitals to set up jungles of Catan with 18 open-air wards containing 300 to 400 patients, each wounded, increasingly sick, and weak troops. On April 9th of 1942, they removed the women to an island of Corregidor. A plan was put in place to evacuate all the nurses into small groups. 66 nurses remained and were eventually captured when the fall of Corregidor on May 6, 1942. This was known as the largest group of women from America taken captive and imprisoned by an enemy during war. These nurses were used as propaganda by the Japanese to boost their victories in the Philippines, and American used them to inspire patriotism and revenge against the Philippines. In July, the nurses were once again moved to the Santa Cantila internment camps located in Manila. Nurses helped establish the grounds of this camp while also doing a lot for the camp. They stemmed epidemics and overcrowding camps, overnights of a public health campaign
do this all under the most unsanitary conditions possible and treated many patients with minimal supplies, and also conditions for accidents, disease, and malnutrition, with the starvation and disease rate around 32% in the camps, leading to a lot of weight loss. The nurses fought to survive and fought to ensure other survival. Once again, 77 of the nurses survived in the liberation in early February and then moved to Los Banos, where they were eventually liberated once again. Chief Nurse Captain Maudsley Davidson, as 57 years old, was captured with decades of service experience, including during World War I. Beside her was Lieutenant Joseph Nisbel. Under Davidson's in second command was a 47-year-old. These nurses maintained a regular schedule of nursing duty while prisoners. Their routine, daily, consistent 4-hour shifts, giving them a purpose and a reason to survive. Fast forward to 2001, Maud Davidson was granted a Distinguished Service Medal, as well as a museum honoring these angels and their service to our country during World War II.
Ruth Miller, formerly Ruth Smith, a 22-year-old nurse from Marshalltown, had joined the Army in May of 1943.
Then the more we heard about the war, I began to think that maybe it would be a good place to be involved and do my part.
After being commissioned as a second lieutenant, Miller was assigned to the 110th Evacuation Hospital and sent to Europe. The 110th's job was to set up near the battlefront, bandage wounded soldiers, and if necessary, perform surgery. After treatment, the soldiers would be transported to hospitals farther from the battle. The 110th went to England in June of 1944. Miller's first assignment was the penicillin team. At the time, penicillin was a new miracle drug that had to be mixed just before use.
We just went around every 4 hours, and if they were sleeping, we had to wake them up. And the boy said, "We almost rather go back and face a German than you people coming around stabbing us every 4 hours," but it saved so many lives, and it was good.
In one last attempt to get Allied forces out of Europe, Adolf Hitler ordered his army to counterattack in December of 1944. During this last desperate move, the German army pushed 60 miles into Allied territory. The assault became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The name was given to this pivotal encounter because the front line looked like a bulge on battlefield maps. Earlier, during the month of September, the 110th Evacuation Hospital had moved to Luxembourg and set up a field hospital in the town of Esch. Ruth Miller, unaware of the events unfolding nearby, was preparing for a New Year's Eve party along with other nurses from the 110th. As the men were brought in, Miller's belief that her work involved more than just the treatment of physical wounds was reinforced.
They were so happy to see somebody from home, from America, and it boosted their morale, and that we were there to take care of them. And I'm sure it made them think of their own girlfriends and wives and mothers too, you know. And it was just really a good feeling to know that you were there to help them out and try and boost their morale, because, oh, what they went through, suffering was awful. They say war is hell, but I say it's devastating, it's cruel, it's just terrible.
WAI is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the encouragement and advancement of women in all aviation career fields and interests. During World War II, women started more jobs during this time. WASP also helped the women in the military when women started becoming more involved in combat. By 1944, around 6,000 women had been trained as link trainer operators and were teaching male pilots how to read instruments. In 1941, the Southern Rhodesia Women's Auxiliary Air Service was commissioned. Within a few months, over 100 women recruits were providing clerical services, sewing skills, parachute packing, and serving as drivers, equipment assistants, and mechanics. Hazel Ying Lee was an American pilot who flew for the Women's Air Force Service pilots during World War II. Hazel was born on experienced women's pilots and was eager to join the WASP. And responding to interview by request by Ran. After the attack on Pearl Harbor and the lives lost of the American pilots, it became clear that there were not enough males to sustain the war effort at home. With WASP just created, they let women join as pilots after training. Lee was the first Chinese-American woman to fly for the United States military. For over 3 decades after the war, members of the WASP and their supporters attempted to secure military status for the women's pilots. Still, no military benefits were offered. Lee died in 1944 by colliding into another plane. 38 WASP pilots died in service during the years of World War II, and Lee was the last to die during the program. In 2010, she and all other WASP pilots during the war received the Congressional Gold Medal. Lee has since been remembered for a legacy of fighting towards equality, inclusion, and her bravery and her record of service.
The WAC stands for Women's Army Corps. Over 150,000 American women served in the WAC during World War II. Members of the WAC were the first women other than nurses to serve within the ranks of the United States Army. At this time, political and military leaders finally realized that women could supply additional resources that were desperately needed in the military. Similar to the WAC, another acronym used was WAVES, and this stood for Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. These women were in the U.S. Armed Forces and worked as pilots, drivers, mechanics, linguists, communications specialists, and sheet metal workers, among many other roles. Another important role taken on by women includes the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or WAAF, which was founded in June 1939 to free up RAF personnel for frontline duties. By 1943, the WAAF had 182,000 members. The WAAFs undertook a variety of roles, which included compiling weather reports, maintaining aircraft, serving on airfields, and working in intelligence.
Since Clara Barton founded the American Red Cross in 1881, women have played an important role in advancing the organization programs and services. The Gray Ladies began in 1918 at the Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, D.C. There, female volunteers provided recreational services to patients, most of whom were war veterans. They were called Gray Ladies because they wore gray dresses and veils as uniforms. During World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, the Gray Ladies would write letters, read to wounded soldiers, help them get involved in crafts and other activities that did much to ease the loneliness and boredom of long hospital stays. They also provided care for disaster victims. They also provided hospitality services in Red Cross blood centers and helped care for disaster victims. After the war ended, the Gray Lady service disappeared, and volunteers who performed its functions were simply called members of the Red Cross Volunteer Services. Also created by women was the American Red Cross Motor Corps. It was discovered in 1918 to transport the sick and wounded from troop trains to local hospitals, deliver supplies to and from warehouses, and take canteen workers and nurses to their posts. The Motor Corps continued to be an active and vital service of the American Red Cross. During World War II, 45,000 women enrolled in the Motor Corps. The volunteers were a group of dedicated and passionate women who managed to drive more than 8 million miles from 1946 to 1947. Over the course of the war, more than 16 million service members received Red Cross aid, made possible by over 7.5 million Red Cross volunteers.
Over 350,000 women in the U.S. served in armed forces during World War II, both at home and abroad. This included women who worked in defense plants and volunteered for war-related organizations, in addition to managing their households, as well as the United States Army Nurse Corps, who were a group of nurses stationed in the Philippines. A number of all-female units in the Polish forces in exile were also established. Major groups included Anders Army and the Women's Auxiliary Force Service, which was deployed in Italy and served across the Polish Army, Navy, and Air Force. This also includes the Angels of Bataan. In 1940 through 1945, women were critical to the war effort. This was the era of Rosie the Riveter. When Rosie was introduced, female percentages in the U.S. of the workforce increased from 27% to 37% by 1945. 1 out of every 4 married women worked outside of their homes. The war allowed women to work in more types of jobs than ever before. General George Marshall supported the idea of introducing a women's service branch into the Army. In May of 1942, Congress instituted the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, WAC, which granted military status. The organization worked for more than 200 non-combat jobs on the state sides in every theater of the war. By 1945, there were more than 100,000 women in this organization and around 6,000 female officers. These women were members of the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service WAVES. These women have the same status as naval reservists and provided support stateside. More than 100,000 WASPs served, 38 of them losing their lives during the war. These fallen WASPs were granted no military honors or benefits, and it wasn't until 1977 that the WASP received full military status. Women were traditionally in fields like nursing and teaching. Then post-Pearl Harbor, women worked in a variety of positions that were profusely close to them in the aviation industry's greatest increase in female workers. Today, towards the end of the war, males started to return home, and then once again, females were pressured into the at-home lifestyle.
On Saturday, June 12, 1948, the Women's Armed Services Integration Act was signed and legally allowed women to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces in a number of official places. This allowed women to serve in all 4 branches of the military. This bill was proposed to the 80th U.S. Congress by Margaret Chase Smith, who served in both sections of the U.S. Congress representing the state of Maine, and went into the Armed Service Committees of both Houses and Senate in January 1948. Margaret concerned herself particularly with the status of women in the armed forces. She played a major role in the passage of Women's Armed Service Integration Act, which gave women equal pay, rank, and privileges. She quickly established herself as an outspoken legislator of high integrity and considerable influence.
Rosie the Riveter served as a poster girl for production during World War II and rapidly turned into a symbol of women's empowerment, continuing to serve as such until this day. She's most easily recognized by her famous picture. Although only an image, Rosie the Riveter changed the course of World War II as well as the role of women during a time period where sexism was habitual. Her origin first sparked from the mind of J. Howard Miller, a Pittsburgh artist set on urging women to join the workforce through patriotism during the time of war. He placed her on a recruitment poster for Westinghouse Electric Corporation. She remained unnamed, but an icon nevertheless, until singers Red Evans and John Jacob Leab debuted their influential hit, Rosie the Riveter, in early 1943. On May 29, 1943, famous artist of the time period, Norman Rockwell, featured her image on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, skyrocketing Rosie into popularity. Since then, between posters, newspapers, articles, and photographs, the photo of her strong female character was plastered all across America, in turn becoming one of the most successful recruitment tools in American history.
World War II led Americans to rethink their ideas about gender and how women and men should look and behave, what qualities they should exhibit, and what roles they should assume in the families and communities. Rosie the Riveter was seen as strong and iconic for the 19 million women who worked for wages during the war. Despite working to help America during the war, they were still harassed by their male coworkers. Men didn't like the idea of women doing physically difficult tasks that required strength, and most responded with resilience towards their female counterparts. Employers attempted to preserve that pre-war gender order by separating male and female workers and paying women less wages. Americans didn't like the idea of women spending time away from their families and children. Without the war to justify the unconventional work of women, many employers pushed women out of the higher-paying jobs that they held during the war and out of the workforce entirely, or into lower-paying, less secure, pink-collar jobs. Women were not appreciated or treated equal, and even as of 2021, average women's earnings are still 80% of males.
Around 2 million children were evacuated from their homes at the start of World War II. Children endured rationing, gas mask lessons, and adapting to living with other families. In Massachusetts, the Springfield Armory depended on women working during the World War II. Across the street from the armory, there was a daycare center, which provided a huge benefit for both working women and factory owners. This daycare gained the factory more working women who were mothers. The daycare also allowed mothers working at their armory to provide their family with better wages and earned their children the education provided by the daycare. World War II created more factories, which led to the need of family workers during the war. This gave women a chance to change their status in America, also being known as women who mostly stayed home and doing housework. Daycares assured working mothers with security that their children would be safe while they worked in factories across the country. Much like working women, immigrant women also needed daycare centers and nurseries. Most of these women had to work for a living, and places that would care for their children became vital for their situations. Although this was good news for working women, social workers and childcare applicants were extremely against daycare systems. They encouraged mothers to stay home and not work. They thought working would harm their family life. Social workers believed mothers should be at home tending to their children, and if they weren't, it would be a burden to have both a mother work and tend to her family. They also believed that being a mother and raising children could be looked at as a patriotic duty itself without serving your country. They were also known to believe that children would be negatively affected in the long term because they thought a child without a mother's full attention would be deprived in places like daycare. This eventually led to the resist and the control of expanding daycares in the early years of war. Among people who supported the role of daycares was First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. In 1942, Eleanor urged her husband, President Roosevelt, to approve the first government-sponsored child care center under the Community Facilities Act. This act provided aid to communities impacted by the war. This money would go towards helping schools, hospitals, water sewers, and recreational facilities. Eleanor had main bases in Connecticut, Texas, and North Carolina, along with other smaller locations. Eleanor was a longtime advocate for women working outside of their homes. She set out to provide benefits for thousands of working women in armed forces and families, traveled across the country searching for answers to these problems, and helped women find childcare. Total number of children that were covered was 105,000, but there was an estimated 2 million who still needed care. While traveling, Eleanor had the luxury of meeting Henry Kaiser and son Edgar while visiting the Kaiser Company shipyard in Portland, Oregon, where women made up 60% of the workforce. While their plans were put in place to construct a child care center, which would soon become the Swan Island Center. This center would be equipped with the new play equipment, sophisticated teaching devices, and a cafeteria staffed by nutritionists, and the infirmary staffed by nurses and doctors. Within the first year of opening, it served more than 2,000 children and provided nationwide childcare. The war ended and the need for childcare decreased. When shipyards closed, federal funding for childcare dried up, and the demand for women needing childcare still continued. Many women wanted to keep working after the war. The Richmond community urged the federal and state government to continue this funding. This led California becoming one of the few states that continued to support childcare after the war had ended. No matter how hard the needs of working women were, they were never unfortunately met.
During World War II, the federal government used the Lanham Act of 1940, which was the legislation that provided federal grants or loans for war-related infrastructure projects. This in turn paid for child care facilities in areas where many women were employed in defense-related industries. The Lanham Act centers operated for just 3 years from 1943 to 1946, eventually serving about 600,000 children ages 0 to 12, regardless of family income. At its peak in 1944, 130,000 children were enrolled in centers. Lanham Act spending was highest in California, Washington, Oregon, Florida, and Arizona, where many defense-related industries were located. It is said that the Lanham Act was a World War II-era child care program that allowed mothers to enter the workforce in record numbers, which eventually led to positive effects in children that lasted into their adulthood. Up next, we're going to show you a video which will take you through the story of Martha Sharp and her family and their fight against the Nazis.
For a fleeting moment, we had the vain hope that the urgent needs of the Czech people might move the U.S. Congress to open the country's doors.
Martha and Waitstill Sharp had to struggle against the immigration restrictions of their own government.
Our requests for special consideration were being ignored in Washington. The old U.S. quota for Czechoslovakia allowed 2,800 Czechs to enter the U.S. yearly on immigration visas. At that pace, most refugees realized that they might wait several decades to get an American visa. But looking that far into the future was a luxury. For most refugees, their greatest need was finding a safe bed for the night.
There was an enormous anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Semitism, and deep racism.
No country, literally no country, was prepared to take Jewish refugees. After the Nazis entered Prague, we found out very quickly that to get any further where we could live permanently was nearly impossible.
I shall never forget the shock when I saw a Jewish man being abused on the street. I would have cried aloud in anger if Waitstill had not silenced my spontaneous outburst. All my life I hated unfairness, and as I spoke to individual Jewish refugees, I felt their dignity and recognized their amazing capacity to rise above Nazi mistreatment. On March 24th, I met with Tessa Roundtree from the Quaker Underground. She asked me to help smuggle groups of refugee families by train through the heart of Nazi Germany.
So my father went through a great deal getting a permit to get out. And so there was this problem about how do you get from Prague to London without going through Germany. It is essentially impossible.
The groups included some of the most wanted and well-known anti-Nazis and their families, including one of the most famous surgeons in the world, a female scientist, and 2 journalists. But of course, we had to hide their identities. They were to leave the country under the guise of household workers, so that if their papers were checked, they would appear to be simple gardeners, cooks, or farmers. Once we made the arrangements to take the refugees on this perilous ride, I didn't know if I would ever see Waitstill again. The train was announced. We got on board, everyone deeply moved at parting, for they were not sure if we would reach our destination.
We were going from Prague, Dresden, Leipzig, to the Dutch border.
If the Gestapo should charge us with assisting the refugees to escape, prison would be a light sentence. Torture and death were the usual punishments. At the German border, our passports and visas were carefully examined. My heart was pounding as I thought about Waitstill, Hastings, and young Martha Content.
When you got to the border, they came by and said, "Alle Juden aussteigen." All the Jews had to get out. They separated the men and the women. We didn't know if we'd ever see each other again. They checked you, and they really checked you. I mean, they did very careful examination, every possible orifice in your body. At one point, one of these German officers said, "Is that all?" And my father said, "Yes." And they said, "What's that on your finger?" And he said, "Well, that's a wedding ring." And they said, "No, you can't take that with you." So they took it off, and that was the end of his wedding ring. And shortly after the train pulled out of the station, an SS man came. And I remember that. It was a very dramatic thing. So we had the joy of riding with an SS man for 6 hours. I was sleeping most of the time. And my mother was terrified, if I were to kick him or something, then that would be the end of us all.
We're traveling all through Germany. We weren't even allowed to look out at the window, you see. The windows had to be blacked out all the time. And I remember, these long periods, when it wasn't moving at all.
At the final border crossing, the customs officers came aboard to check my list against their documents. Then I heard my name called. 2 of the journalists in my party were standing on the platform with their luggage, trembling with fear. The officials had ordered them off the train and were going to send them back to Germany because their names did not appear on my list. Quickly, I turned away and added the men's names to the list. These 2 men are in my party. Shaking his head, he okayed their passports, and we all climbed aboard the train once again.
And then we were in Holland, and I remember my parents being ecstatic.
We arrived in Holland, exhausted and relieved, and then I took the group by boat to London.
I have a picture showing us when we first arrived in England, and it shows the clothes we came in. And they were the Austrian national costume, and those were literally the only clothes we had. We weren't allowed to take anything else.
Dear Mrs. Sharp, we shall never forget what you have done for us and wish to thank you from the depth of our hearts.
Every life we touched had its own drama. One can only manage a miracle every so often, but a series of miracles can happen when many people become concerned and are willing to act at the right time. Waitstill had gone out to a meeting in Geneva, and finally the Gestapo tore up his return permission so that he was not going to be able to come back in again. And then I received word from my underground. The Nazis are going to arrest you and take you to prison. I packed everything I could, got aboard a train, and went straight up to London. I met my husband, and we both sailed back to the United States on the Queen Mary.
As we plowed west through sunlit seas, we were summoned to the Grand Salon. The radio crackled out the news, and we heard the voice of the Prime Minister of England. The Parliament of England declares that a state of war obtains now between the United Kingdom and the Imperial German government, announcing the end of peace in our time. The order had been sent down from the captain's bridge, "Give her the max." The ship came alive. She hit the great waves of the North Atlantic with such violence that the sea came right over the ship.
We were no longer aboard a civilian ocean liner. We had become a war target. The course of our ship was changed to run north, for German submarines had been reported due west, waiting to sink this pride of the British fleet. Portholes were fastened and painted black to prevent the light from showing, and nobody was allowed to smoke on deck at night.
This was the biggest ship in the world. Of course, she was no match for any German torpedoes. Well, she made it. We landed, and the chapter was over.
We docked in New York, and we're back in another world. Love, children's arms, plentiful food. And the only tension that concerned Americans in September seemed to be which baseball team would win the series. Most Americans were not really concerned with the war, nor did they understand why it was declared. Life was still pretty secure in the good old United States of America.
Many women found jobs during the war, especially in heavy industry. This fell along the lines of the men's jobs. With fathers in the military and mothers in the workplace, children's lives began to change. The federal government spent $50 million building daycare centers for children of working mothers. Even with the daycare, only 130,000 kids ended up going to these. This is because women preferred to leave their children with their neighbors or friends instead of sending them.
As the men enlisting in the military to fight the war left gaping holes in the industrial labor force, women came with eager hearts to fill their place. Taking inspiration from Rosie, they entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and between 1940 and 1945, the female percentage of the U.S. workforce increased from a measly 27% to almost 37%. By the end of the war, nearly 1 out of every 4 married women worked within the labor force outside of their expected duties at home. They took on a variety of positions based mainly in war production, ranging from ammunition and lumber to agriculture and government. Rosie's propaganda and the need for women in the workforce was only meant to be temporary, and women were expected to quit and return to their household duties once their husbands returned from the war. After World War II, however, many women got a taste of financial freedom, something few had experienced before their involvement, and refused to go back to their old ways. This expanded female roles in important work facilities and changed men's view on their superiority for years to come.